Thank you.
It's a pleasure to follow the noble Viscount Colville and to agree with everything he said on both loot boxes and unconventional games that are not currently classified as gambling. I won't repeat any of it, but I would just like to say I agree with pretty well everything he said on those issues. I should declare my membership of Peers for Gambling Reform, and also that I'm a Vice President of the LGA and the NALC. And begin, as I think everyone has universally, by welcoming this extremely important report and the very clear and powerful introduction from the Noble Lord Grade. And as pretty well everyone has noticed, this was published 2 years ago, and yet here we are today. And I think it's really noticeable that often when we talk about reports and we say things have moved on, well, really, nothing has got any better in all of these issues covered by this report in the last 2 years. That's 2 lost years where, as we've discussed, so many individual people and families have suffered so much, but also communities have suffered. And I particularly want to focus on that community, the place-based damage, which is highlighted in this report. But I think when we look at the government response, it's sadly very lacking in acknowledgement of the damage done to communities. It does acknowledge the individual, but not the community the damage. And I think if we think about what has moved on since then, and certainly the focus has been very much in the last few months, is the cost of living crisis. We've had a lot of talk about gambling as a leisure activity, an optional thing. So you might expect that we would be thinking that the gambling industry would be seeing a big collapse in this situation where we've just had reports out today that more than 2 million meals have been handed out at food banks in the last year. Almost 1 in 10 parents expects to go to a food bank in the next 3 months. You might think, well, people won't have money for gambling. But actually, I think we need to think about what gambling is for very many people. It's not a pleasure or a leisure activity. It's a tax on desperation, on people's desire for some kind of hope. They can't see anything improving in their day-to-day life with their 0 hours contract, gig economy job, low wages, costs going up and up and up. And yet that moment when you put down the bet and you think, this could really make a difference, things could change. And you know that the chances of that happening are vanishingly small, but you really, really need that moment of hope. It's a very human need to think suddenly things could be much better for me. And that's what we have a tax on the state of our society. And I think I'd agree with many things that the Right Reverend Pellet, the Bishop of St Albans, said in his very powerful speech. But I think one of the things this report does very powerfully is highlights the link that has become between sport and gambling. What we have seen really is a perversion of sport, that it's become a vehicle for gambling. And again, when we talk about the issue of gambling being a leisure activity, well, how many other leisure activities have effectively been denied to people? And we think about sport. We might hope that people might have watched that Premier League football game and then gone out to the local football pitch and had a kick around and trying to recreate that brilliant free kick they've just seen. But very likely that local football pitch has been privatised, now has a very significant charge to allow access to it. So many other leisure alternatives have very much been closed off. And I do particularly want to highlight, again picking up on what the Right Reverend Prelate said, paragraph 524 of this report. And I think it is worth highlighting this. This is the report of a carefully considered, evidence-based select committee. Gambling operators should no longer be allowed to advertise on the shirts of sports teams or any other part of their kit. There should be no gambling advertising in or near any sports ground or sports venues, including sports programs. That is the recommendation, carefully considered, coming from the Committee of Your Lordship's House. And I think the Right Reverend Prelate's comparison to tobacco is interesting. There was a huge row, huge expressions of concern when tobacco was banned from this kind of advertising, from all advertising. But no one would go back now. We can see we have in view the idea of zero tobacco. Think of what a social progress that is. And I think it's interesting, the Gambling Commission Chief Executive, Andrew Rhodes, gave a speech this month which pointed out the gross yield for the gambling industry equates to taking £450 a second off customers in the UK. That's a lot of money. And he made a very interesting comparison. He said the industry is worth some £14 billion, and that's roughly the same size as the agriculture industry. Now, elsewhere in your Lordship's House, we're having lots of debates, very rightly, concerned about food security. And think about the fact that we have an industry the same size as the industry feeding ourselves that's gambling. And when I was putting this speech together, I was thinking I'm going to come out here sounding like a real radical, who wants to think about, let's think about what kind of society we want to have and let's shape our society according to what society we'd like to have. But I had some unexpected support earlier from the noble Lord Butler, who in our previous debates has identified himself as a Treasury man. And we heard the Treasury man say, we want to shape and think about the size of gambling in our economy and how we might better allocate the resources and see this capital used to create more jobs and better jobs. So thank you for that support. I was very pleased to hear that. But I think I come to the point not just of the broader issue of the general economy, but how, and this report focuses this, particularly paragraph 112 very clearly, how the damage being done by the industry is not evenly spread across the country. Go down to Chelsea or go up to some of the posh bits of Manchester and you won't find very much sign of the gambling industry. Go, as the report says, that more than half of the nation's 6,000 bookies are in the UK's most deprived areas, and 56% of all the big four betting shops are in the top 30% of most deprived areas in England. So I would put to the noble Lord the Minister that we're expecting, I believe in the Queen's speech, a levelling up bill, then action to address gambling, particularly place-based gambling, should surely be in that levelling up bill. So, and I do actually now want to, going back to the Local Government Association, and I'm not going to go through this report in great detail looking at the time I've spoken already, but I do just want to highlight a couple of points made in its briefing, very detailed briefing released on this this debate today, and if people who haven't looked at it, I really would urge them to look at it, because it does very much address how our local governments are very concerned about their lack of powers and their inadequate powers to deal with this place-based situation. And although we often talk about focusing on what's happening on the internet, a lot of this damage is still very place-based. So what the Local Government Association is calling for is more flexible powers for councils to be able to determine the number and location of local gambling premises in their area, and this is something the Levelling Up Bill might very well help with. Now, I've focused mostly on that area-based issues, but I do just want to also briefly address the problem gambling, the issues of the need for treatment for gambling addiction. And again, the Local Government Association is calling for the mandatory levy. And we saw this on big tobacco. We saw this, the polluter pays principle has become a big thing with Grenfell and the Building Safety Bill we were debating yesterday. Surely we need big bet to pay its way for the damage that it's causing. So, my lords, just one final thought, which is that, as I think the Right Reverend Prelate and several other speakers have referred to, we saw a huge change and a huge growth in gambling after 2005. That was as a result of choices, of policy choices, of decisions made by government that gave us the position we are now today. Very often we're told, oh, we can't regulate, we can't control, we can't create new rules. That's restrictive. It's anti-liberty. But actually choices were made that allowed the situation we have today. Choices have been made that have allowed this industry to operate at vast profits without paying taxes, without paying for the damage it's causing. It's not a case of acting or not acting. We have acted now. We've created where we are now. We can act to create a different kind of model of society.